And I'm starting to get squeamed out. I got all this shit on my back, and a lot of the stuff is very like skin based. And we're in prison. You guys ever heard of the Holmesberg prison experiments?
I have not, and that sounds really scary.
Oh no!
Based on everything you were just saying,
Sounds itchy.
Holmesberg Prison is in Pennsylvania. It's actually visible from the interstate. They're the main interstate, so you can, if you're driving by, you can see this big creepy building on the side of the road. It's Holmesberg Prison, and it is the site of again several major riots, several decades of abuse and neglect. Is one of the most notorious prisons in the American prison system.
Is it an old prison? Is this like a Sing Sing or like a
1800?
Built in 1896.
1896.
Wow.
Ooh.
And continuous use until 1995.
95.
Oh!
That had to be really bad the last few years. That had to be really dank.
One of the inmates described it as being so devoid of sunlight that they felt like that was part of their punishment as well. That they were they were sunlight was taken away from them. That they small patches of outside were available to the inmates for very short periods of time.
Like before they knew about vitamin D.
I was about to say no vitamin D for you.
In 95?
No.
In 95, they were like, I don't give a fuck about vitamin D. Get back in your
we've
bed.
really committed to the darkness things. We're going to
Spray
stick with
down
it.
with Monsanto. From what I've read, apparently the racial population difference was about 85 to 90% black to white. It was here that Dr. Albert Klingman, or Klingman, as some of the places have it listed, basically found his what he called his fertile ground. At one point, he was famously quoted as saying, when he was introduced to the prison inmates as a dermatologist at the time, all I saw before me were acres of skin. It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time.
That's creepy.
So during the next 20 years, this man proceeded to experiment on the inmates of Holmesburg Prison under a kind of pay-for-skin sort of scheme in which the prisoners were paid for their participatory involvement in these experiments.
Naturally.
I'm sure handsomely paid, too. I'm sure, like, really well.
There's some extremely disturbing photographs of them conducting their research in which they enclosed mosquitoes that they knew to have malaria on the skin of patients and watched to make sure that they were being bitten, to make sure that the virus is going in so they could test these vaccines.
With that infection by vector is like if the skin is punctured?
Yeah.
Yes. In addition to that, a host of sort of non-infectious experiments were also performed on anti-aging medication, deodorants, things for athlete's foot,
Progress, marches forward.
Basically, they would report to a place where they could offer themselves to be experimented on. In fact, in one case, one inmate was said to have showed up at the H block, which was where the hospital block where you showed up to sign up for these services every day, asking if he was needed that day to have whatever the thing of the day was put on him.
Jesus.
The infection du jour. What you got today, Frankie?
That sounds expensive. I'll take it.
So one of the most nefarious experiments that ended up getting exposed later on was actually by the Dow Chemical Company.
Of course.
Surprise. Surprise.
Not evil at all.
I was waiting until a major name dropped.
So one of the most notorious experiments conducted during the Holmesburg prison experiment, 2 decades where this was happening in Pennsylvania, United States, North America. The Dow Chemical Company in the 1960s basically contracted Dr. Klingman to perform a series of tests involving dioxin, which
yeah, that's a very potent nerve gas, is it?
main, I guess, carcinogen, if you want to call it that, in Agent Orange. It was in the herbicide that they used during Vietnam that was causing the health issues with the Vietnam veterans. The understanding from Dow was that dioxin was lethal, that exposure to laboratory animals in doses of less than 1 microgram were lethal to laboratory animals, and that there hadn't been any actual clinical trials done on humans. They asked Dr. Klingman to perform what was known as the dioxin tests. He would apply an ointment of this chemical, TCDD, tetrachlorodibenzo-P-dioxin, which is applied to the skin of the prisoners. Most potent, well, they measured as 75 dioxin compounds. And this was basically, again, from the measurements that Dow had provided, well over what the lethal dose was that they had already measured for laboratory animals. And they were basically asked to test what was happening as they increased the dose of dioxin on these men.
Wow.
What could go wrong?
This is insane.
Hey, this stuff is really horrible. Let's find out how horrible it can get.
A variety of cosmetic and dermatological products were tested on the inmates there, including this nefarious Dow dioxin experiment that happened, and which apparently happened because there was an outbreak of symptoms related to dioxin toxicity at a Dow plant. And one of the results of, I guess, the post-mortem was, okay, we need to find out more about this. So they contacted this prison and said, hey, can you infect a bunch of these prisoners with this thing so we can find out what it does?
Basically, they're trying to figure out how much we put this in something that doesn't kill you. We know it's going to kill you if we put in too much. Yeah, can we find just enough?
So I'm guessing this did not work out.
You would be wrong. Dr. Klingman actually went on to develop several successful dermatology products. Retin A is one of them, which is apparently like an anti-wrinkle cream, as well as acne medication. I'm not sure what the name of it was. From
it topical?
Yes.
Oh. I've used them all.
These souls died,
Yeah.
so teenagers could have smooth skin.
Well, you got to be hot during high school. Like, when else are you going to be hot?
Truth.
In addition to shampoos that make people's hair fall out and just like, whatever the at one point it was described as, quote unquote, the Kmart of human experimentation. It was companies were reaching out to this prison in order to buy skin off of prisoners.
Wow.
The worst blue light special ever.
And it was interesting that we brought up the Nuremberg trials earlier because that actually ties into this. The Nuremberg Code was put into law in 1964, I believe it was, and that essentially made the parameters for human participation in medical experimentation. Certain parameters had to be met in order for it to be illegal experimentation. The person had to be aware of what was going to happen, what the potential side effects were, et cetera, et cetera. And they were the argument was that when we were trying the Nazis in the Nuremberg trials, they didn't provide any of this this was like the legal bedrock of the argument that like you didn't tell them any of this shit was happening. And then now you're going to jail.
Well, I mean, that's true, though. They
Correct.
It's messed up, though. I mean, it's absolutely horrible and brutal, but at least you told them.
Yeah, they didn't say what was going to happen to them, though.
Right. So using that, I guess, as a yardstick for what would be acceptable, one of the board of trustees of the prison ended up shedding light on the whole thing. He compiled a book and labeled it "Acres of Skin." Of the
Acres
story.
of Skin.
The story. You can read this book.
Why didn't I think of that name?
Gross.
Band name.
Son of a bitch.
Eye of the Acres of Skin.
You fucking son of a bitch.
So. In 1974, I believe, was when the actual trial for Dr. Klingman took place. And as you can expect, he was like a total douche about it. Like, he didn't really seem to understand the gravity of what happened. He said, to his knowledge, none of the experiments caused any deaths, and all had resulted in furthering of the knowledge of of dermatology and science.
Wow. Look at these teenagers' skin. I mean, how can you argue
How
with that?
smooth.
The death was worth it.
They're beautiful.
Yeah.
So the guy's name who ended up becoming the whistleblower, his name was Mr. Hornblum. He was the literary instructor at the detention center, and he ended up having, I guess, a lot of contact with the members of the experiments. One of the quotes I remember reading was that when he first showed up, he remember seeing an entire yard full of men with bandages wrapped all around their backs, and asked if there was some terrible riot or fight, and was told pretty casually that, oh no, those are the guys in the experiments. Basically, those are the experiments.
Those are the skin moles.
Right, exactly. That's my skin.
What the hell does that mean?
That's just my skin. after Hornblum left the prison, he basically compiled all this information and wrote a tell-all book, and the result was an update to the U.S. National Code about human experimentation. Participants have to be properly compensated, have to be properly informed of what they're going to be getting into, etc. And the argument was that none of these men were. And in fact, it seemed to be preying mostly on people of lower intelligence, people who weren't able to give traditional, consent. And the idea that it was being paid for was that it kind of put it into this, did they need money to participate in certain things so that they had to go and give themselves?
They created a system where it was inherent, that it was inevitable that they would sign up for these things in order to just survive in that prison.
Exactly.
Right.
Participation was mandatory.
To improve their lives in some weird way.
Yeah,
exactly.
I need food that
Which is weak. It's pretty weak, the whole, I need food, but...
Wow.
One of the inmates ended up getting out, getting tested by independent doctors, and suing the prison and the city for $400,000 back in the 70s or something like that. So it was quite a bit of money.
Jesus.
Through the book Acres of Skin, and just the news reports that came out of there that it was a pretty wholesale type of human experimentation thing going on at the prison. And while I was reading it, it sounds like that wasn't the only one. I mean, before that, there were several instances of people testing malaria drugs. I actually read one really disturbing article about a prison in California in the early 20th century, 1900-something, where medical records of testicular transplant
how did that even work?
taken place.
Stop using those words.
So it was apparently the idea of of using prisoners as fodder for scientific experimentation is old and strange and terrifying.
Yeah.
As a historied presence in America.
Well, I don't like that at all.
I'm not a fan.